Hello, I'm Al Castro, and welcome to another episode of Sergeant Al's Traffic Ticket Blog. We continue our ongoing series of episodes on the Nissan Leaf, actually, by wrapping it up by having the Nissan Leaf itself in our hands to have an interview with Cameron from Truro, who has a Nissan Leaf and was able to provide us with a road test to see what the vehicle is like. In this first part of this three-part of the tail end of the Nissan Leaf episodes, we're going to talk about his first Nissan Leaf, which was the short-range model that had about 80, 90 miles of range, and what he had to go through when he had the vehicle. But what I'd like to do right now, actually, is answer readers' questions. And this brings me to the point that if you have any questions at all about electromobility, autonomobility, or law enforcement issues, as is the case with my original blog, please don't hesitate and reach out to me at contact@alcastro.com, and I will be more than glad to answer your questions if I can. This one I did answer. I answered it a few months ago on my blog at alcastro.com/blog. And it's a common problem that a lot of potential and present Nissan Leaf owners have when it's about driving the vehicle for a prolonged distance. And in this case, it was to pick up the car from the dealership that was 500 miles away. Tricia writes, "Dear Sergeant Al, request for input. I'm about to purchase a 2017 Nissan Leaf. The dealer is 500 miles away, so I'll need to stop to charge 4 times on the journey home. I was thinking I'd call every Nissan dealership between me and there to see who has a fast charging station. Just planning the trip to get the car is making me rethink my decision. My other option is to save yet another $12,000 and buy a 2017 Bolt. I'm wide open to suggestions. P.S. Love your in-depth research and informative articles. I was inspired by the one where you explained why it makes sense, and sense," she writes, CENTS in parentheses, "to buy a used BEV. Oh, one more thing. Can we eventually swap out this car's 40 kilowatt battery for a bigger one so that we can extend the range of this 2017 Nissan Leaf?" All right, thank you, Tricia, for asking these questions. Let's take a stab at this. First of all, I am not, contrary to what people tell me in the comments section, and over the course of reading my social media feed, I am not anti-hybrid, okay? If anything, I am anti-tiny battery. There is no need anymore for these car manufacturers to make these tiny batteries, okay? The lithium ion process is cheap. It is cheap now. It is at its peak industrial worthiness to make in mass production, where it no longer affects the cost of making the vehicle, and they can pass the savings on to the consumer. The problem is that because you need a completely separate, different supply chain to make an electric car. And this is why car manufacturers cannot make both vehicles side by side. A lot of them talk about cross-platforming. That is about compromising in the materials and the quality, the build quality. Something has to give in order to have that, unless the car is hand assembled and it's a $200,000-$300,000 car like a Rolls Royce. The only ones that can do cross-platforming and do it really nice and customize is Rolls Royce, Aston Martin, Bentley, okay? And as I'm going to be pointing out in future episodes, and if you've been paying attention on my social media feed, even they are getting away from that. They're immersing themselves into electromobility. Why make a W16 or a V12 engine when you can make a tiny electric motor that has an output 5 times more than that? So, and they're starting to realize that. They're starting to stretch their legs now with electromobility to see their potential. So there's no need to be making these tiny batteries anymore. So when you have a vehicle that has that, that's about a gasoline car company that has not switched supply chains yet to make a battery electric vehicle the way Tesla does, the way a battery electric vehicle should be made. And this is the problem that the industry is having. You can't have it both ways, okay? You either have to make the switch with the supply chain. So this is why, ironically, the only ones that actually could afford to do it, but they would eventually run out of money and they would have to make up their minds which ones they would want to make, otherwise they would have to go out of business, is General Motors and VW Group. And like I said, that money would drain itself out, where it would get down to the point where they would either have to face bankruptcy or decide which kind of vehicle they really want to make. But you can't really make both side by side. They require separate supply chains, and supply chains are very, very expensive. Those are the raw materials that car makers get together. They get it from suppliers so that they can make the vehicle the way they want to. So that's how that works. So yeah, that's the dynamic that faces vehicles that have tiny batteries, whether they're a hybrid, a plug-in hybrid, or a compliance electric car, or a car like a Nissan Leaf that has a very limited range. So the two problems that I have with the Nissan Leaf is, beside the battery, batteries require cooling. The bigger the battery, the longer it will last, the longer its longevity, the more difficult it will be for it to get hot, the more difficult it will be for it to freeze. Because there's a lot of lithium ion, there's a lot of pack in the battery. The battery has a lot of landscape to work with to try to establish some kind of equilibrium so that it has some steady supply that it can give the motor so that it can operate. Tiny batteries are the opposite of that. The tinier the battery, the quicker it gets to boil, the quicker it freezes, the shorter its longevity, and the shorter its cycle, the shorter its range. That's why you really don't want to have a tiny battery. So these are the problems that a typical owner faces with the Nissan Leaf. Now, in that, I tell you that I am not anti-Nissan Leaf. I don't think it's worth the value of a $33,000 car, in at least in its short-range version. However, as a late model used car, it cannot be beat. I remember when I wrote that article that Trisha was referring to about buying a late model used BEV as a good value for a used car. There was a lull in the market at that particular time when I wrote that. And there was a price point of about $11,000 for a lease-end Nissan Leaf that was 1, 2, 3 years old. And for a price like that, and plus you're getting the latest technology features, that if you spent that same money on a gasoline vehicle, the gasoline vehicle most likely would be older and it wouldn't have all of those safety features. It would only have some of them. So this is a value that you really can't beat. And especially if this is for a younger adult person, like a high school or a college student, the person who's in the market that's shopping for this person can turn them immediately on to electromobility, and they have all the latest features. They have lane departure warning, they have all the airbags, all the crash cushions, anti-lock brakes, they have everything. So yeah, as a late model used BEV, it cannot be beat. As long as there are government rebates for these vehicles, those rebates are taken and factored in on the resale value at the tail end of the ownership, those savings are passed on to the next buyer. And as we learned a couple of weeks ago at the Orange County Auto Show with Edison, they offer a $1,000 check if you even buy a used BEV, and they tell you specifically how to do that. That was in that episode. So yeah, it as a used car, as a battery electric vehicle, it can't be beat. But Trish brings up an important point in all of this that I really want to take note. She says that for another $12,000, I'm assuming that she already has a down payment of $12,000 for the Nissan Leaf, or she's paying $12,000 cash for it to acquire the vehicle. So she's thinking, if I save another $12,000, I might put myself within striking distance of a Chevy Bolt. I say to that, if that's the case, then why don't you get into striking distance of a base model Tesla Model 3? I have no problem with the Bolt. It's a good car. It's General Motors' way of experimenting with what works before they actually go full production with their battery electric program. But the Tesla Model 3 truly does make a better value, and you can't beat that. So I say to her, if you're going to consider spending an additional $12,000 for a Chevy Bolt, why not talk to Tesla and see what they can do for you to get you in striking distance of that $35,000, $36,000 base Model 3, all right? So Trisha mentions about swapping out the 40 kilowatt battery for a larger one. Coming up hopefully in future episodes, I would like to reach out to somebody who can help me with this. Actually, there's two people, a CFO and a CEO of a battery tray service that can show us what it is a battery tray service can do for customers like Nissan Leaf. Now, as these cars get older, because Nissan announced that they've canceled the car and they're coming up with something new and different, to taking that whole Leaf thing to a different level. I'm going to have them put up on the screen here now a picture of the next generation of Nissan Leaf. I don't even think they're going to even call it Leaf. This vehicle that you see up here on the screen is a crossover version of the Nissan Leaf, and it's coming in a nick of time because Chevy Bolt is coming out with a crossover version as well. This vehicle is larger, it's more versatile, it's more fashioned as a CUV as opposed to a four-door hatch that both Bolt and Leaf are primarily designed as. And it has a larger range, a more reasonable amount of, and competitive, I should say, range that will make it a more compelling buy than the Leaf that we've been used to. What you will be able to do with the battery tray service is you will be able to swap out the battery for a new one, and there will come a time, and this service will be available relatively soon. You will even be able to do things like even put in a bigger battery to convert your short-range BEV into a long-range BEV. And these aftermarket types of services and products are just the tip of the iceberg of what's to come. There will come a time eventually on YouTube where you're going to see older electric cars, like compliance cars, like a Nissan Leaf, even a Chevy Volt with the motor taken out and it being all electric, a Fiat E500, a Smart for 2, where the battery and the motor is swapped and they put some kind of steroided motor in there and they're drag stripping it on YouTube against a Porsche or a Ferrari, and of course the little tiny electric car wins. The kinds of things that we saw with like a Volkswagen Beetle or a Rabbit or a Golf, where they put a Porsche engine in it and then race it against a Porsche or stuff like that, and you see that the Beetle beats it. You're going to start seeing that with electric cars. And one of the things, for those that don't realize this dynamic is coming. These cars are cheaper, faster, and easier to make. There's less components, less parts in them. That's one of the reasons why Tesla was able to turn that muddy swamp in Shanghai around and within 6 months put up that factory and had the cars roll out so quickly. This is why I tell people, if you think you could be driving your gas car into the 21st century, into the 2020s and 30s, think again. I really do believe these cars are only going to be around. I'm talking about the gas cars now. They're only going to be around for like the next 10, maybe 15 years, and that's it. You're going to see this massive conversion. I tell people this is the same gasoline car industry 100 years ago when it was younger and naive, wiped out electric cars off the face of the earth. I mean, the only ones you can find are in museums and car collections. They're going to do the same thing with gasoline vehicles because they're cheaper to make, they're easier to make, they're easier to maintain, and they don't pollute, obviously, as much as gasoline cars do. So that's what's coming down the pike. So that's basically it with Trisha. Trisha did not buy this car, by the way, a postscript to this. This was a dynamic that she would have faced anyway if the car was new, and I'm sure a lot of Nissan Leaf owners face this as well. There's serious issues that are involved in getting this kind of vehicle. You can only use a Nissan Leaf as a commuter vehicle, and it's a little tricky to use it long range. And then to add insult to injury, Nissan never battery cooled it. And that's one of the things that battery tray services will be able to help you with. They will give you cooling options, more active cooling options to cool the battery so that you don't have this problem. And this is a problem that, in particular, that UK customers had in Great Britain with their Leafs. They call it the Nissan Leaf charging drip charging crisis. When your battery gets too hot, it goes into fail-safe. And that reminds me about Trisha's letter. She mentioned something about fast charging. Be careful fast charging a tiny battery electric vehicle, whether it's a PHEV, or a tiny battery electric car. You have to be careful about that. Yeah, fast charging can be a little dangerous. You might blow up the battery. So just be aware of that. So that's basically it. That's how this all started. It started with a question about the Nissan Leaf, and my producers and I decided to make a series of episodes about that, and we are now coming down to the Leaf itself. So coming up in a few minutes, we're going to talk to Cameron Urani about his Nissan Leaf. Now, he's had two of them. He had the original short-range Nissan Leaf, and he traded that in and bought a 2018 Nissan Leaf with a little bit more range. This one has it's still a short-range vehicle, but it has 150 miles. It doubled, which is in a lot of ways a game changer. So we'll talk to Cameron in part one of the Leaf episode series, and that's coming right up in a few minutes. I'm Sergeant Al.